A dark van moves silently down a suburban street, its headlights dimmed to avoid attention. Inside, three men sit in tense silence, their breaths fogging up the windows. They have been planning this for weeks. A simple, clean job. Kidnapping an old woman living alone in the woods should be easy money. They don't know that they have just made the worst mistake of their lives. Their target is Elena Petrov, a frail-looking 79-year-old widow who appears to be just another forgotten soul in a secluded cabin. They assume she will be easy to overpower, that she will be too weak to fight back, that she will be terrified and compliant. What they don't realize is that Elena Petrov is not just an old woman. Decades ago, she was one of the Soviet Union's most lethal intelligence agents, trained in espionage, assassination, and psychological warfare. She has spent her life navigating danger, manipulating enemies, and eliminating threats. And now, in her quiet retirement, she is about to face one more challenge. These men believe they are the hunters, but they are about to become the prey. This is not just another kidnapping story. This is a tale of revenge, deception, and brutal survival. As the night unfolds, the criminals will learn a harsh lesson. Never underestimate an old woman with a past full of deadly secrets. Are you ready for a thriller filled with unexpected twists, high-stakes mind games, and adrenaline-fueled action? Then stay with us, because Elena Petrov is about to remind the world why she was once one of the most dangerous spies to ever live. The van rattled along the empty road, cutting through the darkness like a predator returning to its lair. Inside, Elena sat between Rick and Danny, her hands bound, a rough cloth gag between her lips. She felt the vibrations of the road beneath her, memorizing the turns, the speed changes, the distance traveled. She wasn't panicking. She was studying. Danny sat stiffly beside her, his knee bouncing nervously. He kept glancing at her, as if expecting her to suddenly break free and attack them. Mark, who was driving, noticed. "Relax," he muttered. "She's harmless." Danny forced a chuckle. "Yeah, harmless." Elena shifted slightly, her bound wrists resting on her lap. The ropes were tight but not impossible. She had been in worse situations before. Much worse. These men were sloppy, too confident. That would be their undoing. After an hour, the van slowed. Gravel crunched under the tires as they pulled up to a decrepit warehouse in the middle of nowhere. A single floodlight cast harsh shadows against the rusted walls. Rick opened the van's back doors and pulled Elena out. "Welcome home, lady." She didn't resist as they led her inside. The air smelled of mildew and oil, the kind of place where people disappeared. Metal shelves lined the walls filled with crates and tools. A single chair sat in the middle of the room. Danny hesitated as Mark motioned for him to tie Elena to it. "We really have to do this?" "Yes," Mark snapped. "The last thing we need is for her to run off. Just do it." Danny swallowed and obeyed, securing her wrists to the chair's arms and looping the rope around her waist. Rick double-checked the knots before stepping back. Elena remained motionless, her breathing slow, her expression unreadable. Mark crouched in front of her. "You're going to sit here nice and quiet while we figure out what to do with you, understand?" She blinked at him through the blindfold. Then, ever so slightly, she nodded. Mark smirked. "Good girl." Then they left her alone. Elena listened carefully as their footsteps retreated, stopping just outside the door. She could hear them arguing. Danny's voice was the loudest. "I don't like this. Something's off." "She's an old lady," Mark hissed. "She's not going to do anything." Elena smiled under her gag. She had seen it before. Doubt. It was a powerful weapon, and she intended to use it. But first, she needed to gather intel. Through the fabric of her blindfold, she detected shifting shadows, the dim glow of a light bulb overhead. She tested the chair's stability, noting how the wood creaked slightly. A weak point. Her wrists ached from the ropes, but she felt where they were tied. Not perfect knots, nothing she couldn't handle. The men continued talking outside. "We should have just grabbed the money and left," Danny said. "Why do we even need her?" Mark sighed. "Because our client wants information from her. Something she knows." Rick's voice was lower. "We should at least find out why she's important." Eleanor froze. A client? This wasn't a random kidnapping. Someone had sent them for her. That changed everything. She slowed her breathing, considering her next move. She needed them to talk more, to reveal what they knew. And there was one easy way to do that. She let out a small, deliberate whimper. Just enough. The door swung open, and Danny stepped inside. "Hey, She's awake. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her body trembling just enough to seem helpless. She mumbled something behind the gag. Danny hesitated. Maybe we should take that off. Mark groaned. You're too soft, kid, but fine. Let's see what she has to say. He yanked the gag down. Elena gasped for air, then coughed weakly. She waited just long enough before speaking, her voice shaking. Please, I don't understand. Why are you doing this? Danny frowned. You don't know. She shook her head. I have no money, no family. No one cares about me. Mark snorted. Yeah, well, someone does. Someone paid good money to have you taken. Any idea why? Elena's eyes flickered with something. Fear, confusion, helplessness. All of it an act. I don't know. Her voice cracked. Please, I'm just an old woman. Who would want me? Rick narrowed his eyes. That's what we're wondering too. Eleanor let the silence stretch, watching the tension between them. Doubt. Mistrust. It was already creeping in. Danny shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should just let her go. If she really doesn't know anything. Mark cut him off. No. We wait for instructions. Eleanor lowered her gaze. You're making a mistake. Mark scoffed. Yeah? Why's that? She exhaled softly. Because whoever sent you didn't tell you everything. That was enough. She saw the flicker of hesitation in Rick's eyes. Danny looked even more unsure. Elena leaned back in her chair, her fingers subtly testing the knots on her wrists. They had underestimated her, and that was the first mistake. The warehouse was silent, except for the occasional creak of shifting metal and the murmurs of her captors outside. Elena sat perfectly still, her eyes half-lidded, her breathing slow. Every detail mattered now. The tension between the men, the weaknesses in her restraints, the flickers of doubt she had planted. She was almost ready. Danny was the easiest to break, the youngest, the most uncertain. He didn't belong in this world, he still had a conscience. That made him dangerous, not to Elena but to his own crew. Mark was the leader, confident, reckless. He believed in control, but he wasn't nearly as sharp as he thought. He had no idea he was already losing it. Rick? He was the muscle. He followed orders but had his own doubts. He didn't trust Mark completely. Eleanor had seen the way his eyes lingered when Mark made decisions. He was waiting for an excuse to take control. That excuse was coming soon. She tested the ropes again. Sloppy work. The knots were tight but not cinched properly. She twisted her wrists, feeling the fibers strain, then loosen. Not yet. First, she needed to weaken them further. Eleanor let out a long, slow sigh and slumped forward, her breathing growing shallow. She let her body go limp, her chin dropping to her chest. Within seconds, Danny's voice came from outside. Something's wrong. Footsteps. The door swung open. Rick muttered, What now? She's not moving, Danny said. She was breathing fine before, but now, Mark groaned. For God's sake! Eleanor twitched, making a soft rattling sound in her throat. Then, nothing. Silence. Danny stepped forward. I think she... The second his fingers touched her wrist, Elena moved. She twisted her hands sharply, sliding free of the loose bindings in an instant. Before Danny could react, her fingers found his wrist, twisting it with a sharp, practiced motion. His yelp was cut off by her other hand, clamping down over his mouth. Rick lunged, but Elena was already moving. She yanked Danny forward, using his momentum to throw him straight into Rick. The two men stumbled back, colliding hard with the shelves. Mark swore, reaching for his gun. Too slow. Eleanor grabbed the chair's armrest, snapping it free with a single sharp movement. A jagged piece of wood in her hands became a weapon. She lunged. The wooden spike slammed into Mark's wrist just as he drew his gun. He shouted in pain, dropping the weapon. It hit the concrete floor and skidded across the room. Elena didn't go for it. Not yet. Rick shoved Danny off him and charged, but she sidestepped gracefully, slamming an elbow into his ribs. He gasped, doubling over, and she grabbed him by the back of the head, smashing his face against the metal shelves. Danny scrambled away, eyes wide with panic. Shit, shit! Mark was still clutching his injured wrist, cursing. Elena moved toward him, slow and deliberate. He saw it now. The shift. The old woman wasn't confused, wasn't weak. She was hunting. You... He started to speak, but his breath hitched in pain. Who the hell are you? Eleanor tilted her head. Her voice was quiet, controlled. Someone you should have left alone. Rick groaned, trying to push himself up, but she was faster. She grabbed the discarded gun from the floor, checked the chamber in one fluid motion, and aimed it directly at Mark's head. The room froze. Danny, now cowering near the door, held up his hands. Okay, just don't shoot." Eleanor's eyes never left Mark's. "You never intended to kill me. That was your second mistake." Mark glared at her, breathing hard. "And my first?" She smiled, thinking I was the victim. The weight of the gun felt familiar in her hands, comfortable. It had been years, but muscle memory never faded. Rick was still dazed. Danny was shaking. Mark, however, was calculating. He wasn't scared, he was thinking. Eleanor could see it in his eyes. He was looking for an angle, a way to flip this situation back in his favor. She couldn't allow that. Her grip on the gun tightened. "You work for someone." "Who?" Mark smirked, even through the pain. "You think I'd tell you?" Eleanor stepped forward and pressed the barrel against his knee. Mark's smirk faltered. "You're going to tell me," she murmured, "because the alternative is much worse." The power had shifted. Elena was no longer the captive. She was in control now, and she had no intention of letting them walk away from this unscathed. The gun pressed against Mark's knee, its cold metal biting into his skin. He didn't move. He barely breathed. Rick, still dazed, wiped blood from his nose and struggled to sit up. Danny stood frozen near the door, hands raised, his eyes darting between Elena and his so-called leader. The shift in power was undeniable. Elena could have pulled the trigger. She could have ended it here. But that wasn't what she wanted. Fear was a sharper weapon than bullets. She tilted her head, her gaze steady on Mark. "You work for someone," she said again, voice calm, controlled. "Who?" Mark let out a slow, measured breath, his lips curling into a forced smirk. "You wouldn't shoot." Elena smiled. And then, without hesitation, she pulled the trigger. Bang! Danny screamed. Rick jolted. The bullet didn't hit Mark. It embedded itself into the ground inches from his foot. Dust and debris flew up, the sharp echo ringing through the warehouse. Mark flinched. Elena leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You don't know me, but let me help you understand. I don't make threats." She pressed the barrel against his knee again. "I make decisions." Danny swallowed hard. "Jesus Christ." Elena turned her attention to him, her expression unreadable. "You don't belong here," she murmured. "You've been doubting this job since it started. You don't trust Mark, do you?" Danny opened his mouth, but no words came out. She took a slow step toward him, lowering the gun slightly, not as a sign of weakness, but as a shift in control, an invitation to listen. "How much do you really know about him?" she asked, her voice soft but deliberate. Danny hesitated. He glanced at Mark, who gave him a warning glare. Eleanor chuckled. "Exactly." She turned to Rick next. He was stronger than Danny, but he wasn't stupid. He had doubts too. He wasn't as loyal as he pretended to be. "You've been waiting for a reason to turn on him," she said to Rick. "Haven't you?" Rick frowned. "You don't know what you're talking about." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Don't I?" She gestured toward Mark's injured wrist, then back at Danny. "You saw how quickly he was willing to throw you both into this mess. You think he's telling you everything?" Silence. The seed was planted. Eleanor could see it in the way they shifted, the way their gazes flickered to Mark, with just a little more suspicion than before. It was subtle, but doubt was a slow poison. Mark's jaw clenched. "She's playing games. Don't listen to her." Elena let out a small, amused breath. "Am I?" She stepped back, lowering the gun completely. Not because she trusted them, but because she didn't need it anymore. She had something stronger now. "Danny," she said, turning to the youngest of them, "if you leave now, you might survive this. If you stay with them, you won't." Danny blinked. "What?" "You heard me," she said simply. "They won't let you live after this. Not if they think you'll talk, not if they think you'll betray them." Danny's breathing was unsteady. He looked at Mark, then at Rick. Rick shifted uncomfortably. He knew she was right. And Mark's expression darkened. Elena smiled. "You see it now, don't you?" She walked to the nearest metal shelf, dragging a finger across the dust-covered surface. Her body language was relaxed, effortless, as if she weren't standing in a room with 3 armed men who had kidnapped her just hours ago. "Who do you think is betraying who first?" she mused, tilting her head toward Mark. Rick tensed. Danny took another step back. Elena let the silence stretch, let the paranoia settle. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. No one stopped her. She didn't run, didn't rush. She just walked, slow and steady, as if she owned the space, as if she had already won. Mark was boiling. She could feel it in the heat of his glare, in the way his fingers twitched, aching for a way to regain control. And that was exactly what she wanted. As she reached the door, she paused, just for a moment, and gave one last parting glance over her shoulder. "You should choose wisely," she said to Rick and Danny. Then she stepped outside and disappeared into the night. The air was crisp, cold against her skin. The warehouse lights cast long shadows, but she didn't look back. Inside, she knew exactly what was happening. Rick was doubting Mark. Danny was scared. The foundation of their group was cracking. And Mark? He was furious, desperate, which meant that soon he would make a mistake, and Elena would be ready. The night air was sharp against Elena's skin as she moved through the shadows, slipping away from the warehouse unnoticed. The cold didn't bother her. She had endured far worse in her time. Her mind was already working through the next steps. Rick was unstable. Danny was scared. Mark was losing control. She had planted the seeds of doubt, and now they would destroy each other from the inside. But something was wrong. This was never just a random abduction. Someone wanted her. Someone knew who she was, and that meant her past had finally caught up with her. She kept moving through the darkness, her body remembering the techniques she had learned decades ago. How to blend into the night, how to leave no sound, no trace. For a moment, she was no longer Elena Petrov, the quiet old woman living in the woods. She was Agent Sokolova, the woman who had outlived entire regimes. 30 years ago, East Berlin, 1989. The city was on edge. The Berlin Wall was crumbling, and chaos lurked in every corner. Elena moved through the abandoned streets like a ghost. Her target was a man named Anton Reznikov, a high-ranking Soviet informant attempting to defect. If he reached the West, he would expose countless covert operations, including hers. She had been given a direct order: eliminate him. Elena found him in a safe house near the border, hiding behind armed guards who thought they could protect him. They were wrong. With swift, calculated precision, she infiltrated the building, silent, unseen. One by one, the guards fell, choked, stabbed, silenced before they even knew what had happened. When she reached Reznikov, he was already trembling, his back pressed against the wall. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. "The war is over." Elena had heard those words before. She pulled the trigger. Reznikov's body slumped to the floor, his secrets buried with him. She left no trace behind, just another ghost swallowed by history. Present day. Elena's breath came steady as she reached the tree line, her thoughts snapping back to the present. She had left that life behind. She had built a quiet existence, a new name, a new home, but whoever had sent those men knew who she really was, and they wanted something from her. The question was, what? She crouched behind an old oak tree, scanning her surroundings. The warehouse was still in view, and from inside, muffled voices rose in heated argument. The cracks were already forming. She allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. Then she heard it, a soft shuffle, a breath. Someone was watching her. Elena didn't hesitate. She moved, twisting around and striking in one fluid motion. Her hand snapped forward, grabbing the wrist of the figure in the shadows. A knife clattered to the ground. Danny. The kid was breathing hard, his hands raised in surrender. Wait, I'm not here to hurt you." Elena studied him, her grip unyielding. He was terrified, but not of her, of Mark. "You left," she observed. "Smart choice." Danny swallowed, nodding. "Mark. He's losing it. He knows you're playing us. He thinks Rick is going to turn on him. I just wanted to get out before he kills us all." Elena didn't let go. "Why follow me?" "I don't know." Danny's voice cracked. He exhaled sharply. "I don't know who you are, but I know you're the only one walking away from this alive. I'd rather take my chances with you than stay in there with them." Elena's gaze didn't waver. She had seen men like him before, young, scared, looking for a way out. Most didn't get one, but Danny had made a choice. That meant something. After a long pause, she released his wrist. "You want to live?" she asked. Danny nodded quickly. "Then listen carefully." She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because this isn't just about you anymore. There's something bigger at play, and if we don't figure out what they really wanted from me..." She let the weight of the words settle. "None of us are making it out of this alive." The night air was still, heavy with tension. The warehouse loomed in the distance, its flickering light casting long, shifting shadows through the trees. Elena studied Danny. He was young, inexperienced, and rattled. But he had something Mark and Rick no longer had, an open mind. He could still be useful. She leaned against the tree, arms crossed, watching as he fidgeted. "Tell me everything," she said. Danny exhaled shakily. "Mark, he's paranoid. After you escaped, he lost it. He thinks Rick's going to betray him. He even accused me of helping you." He swallowed. "He said once we get new orders, he might clean house." "I think he means killing us both." Elena nodded. "And these orders? Where do they come from?" Danny hesitated. I don't know. We were just told to grab you and wait for instructions. That's all Mark knows too. Someone higher up is pulling the strings." That confirmed what she suspected. Mark and his crew weren't professionals. They were disposable assets. Someone else was orchestrating this. She tapped her fingers against her arm, thinking, did Mark ever mention a name, a client, a contact? Danny shook his head. No, just that we'd get more information after the job was done. Eleanor glanced back toward the warehouse. Then we need to make sure Mark never gets those orders. Danny tensed. You mean? She met his gaze. I mean, we turn them against each other before that happens. Danny swallowed hard, but he didn't argue. He knew there was no other way out. Inside the warehouse, Rick sat on an overturned crate, clutching his side where Elena had elbowed him earlier. His nose was still bleeding. Mark paced in front of him, his injured wrist bandaged with a strip of cloth. The two men were on edge. You saw her, Rick, Mark muttered. She's not just some old woman, she played us. Rick wiped his nose. Yeah, no shit. Mark turned sharply. So what are you going to do about it? Rick narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Mark took a slow step closer. You were supposed to keep her locked down. She got out. That's on you. Rick let out a dark chuckle. You blaming me? You were the one running your mouth instead of watching her. The room grew heavier. Mark clenched his jaw. We're not getting paid until we finish this job. And I don't trust you to help me do it. Rick stared at him. Then slowly he shook his head. You really are losing it, huh? Mark's fingers twitched toward his gun. Then the warehouse door creaked open. Both men turned sharply, weapons drawn, only to see Danny standing there, hands raised, breathing heavily. She's still out there, he gasped. She's watching us, waiting. She told me one of us is working for her. Rick and Mark stiffened. Danny continued, voice shaking, eyes darting between them. She said she already knew this would happen, that she knew one of us was going to betray the others. Mark's grip on his gun tightened. She's bluffing. Danny nodded quickly. That's what I said. But she laughed. She said she doesn't need to bluff. That she's already planted the seed. Rick's gaze flickered to Mark. Don't listen to him, Mark snapped. She's trying to turn us against each other. Danny shook his head frantically. Then why'd she let me go? Silence. It was a dangerous question. Mark had no answer. Rick exhaled sharply, standing up. You know what? I'm done with this. Mark turned on him. What the hell does that mean? It means I'm done taking orders from a guy who doesn't even know what we're dealing with. Rick cracked his knuckles. I'm not getting killed over your mistakes. Mark aimed his gun at him. Sit down. Rick stared at him, then laughed coldly. Or what? Danny took a slow step back. This was exactly what Elena wanted. The seed had been planted. Mark's paranoia. Rick's distrust. And now with one final push they would destroy each other. Elena watched from the trees, unseen. She could hear the tension breaking, like a rope fraying under pressure. She had just turned their weapons on each other, and the best part? She hadn't even fired a single shot. Elena crouched in the shadows, her eyes locked on the warehouse. The trap was already closing in on itself. Inside, Rick and Mark were seconds away from tearing each other apart. Danny had played his role perfectly, stirring the paranoia, planting the doubt. It was only a matter of time before one of them made the first move. But Elena wasn't done. She needed to push them further. She turned to Danny, who was still tense beside her, eyes wide, heart pounding. You did well, she murmured. He swallowed. They're gonna kill each other, aren't they? Elena's lips curled slightly. If we do this right, they will. Danny exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. I still don't get it. Why? Why go through all this? Why not just kill them yourself? Elena met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Because I don't need to. She tapped her temple. Psychological warfare is about patience, control, letting the enemy destroy themselves. Danny shivered. He wasn't sure whether to be impressed or terrified. Elena turned back toward the warehouse. It was time for the final act. Inside the warehouse, Mark was pacing, his fingers twitching near his gun. His breathing was heavy, sharp. He was unraveling. Rick sat on a crate, arms crossed, watching him with disgust. "You're really losing it, aren't you?" Mark snapped toward him. "You think this is a game? She's out there, Rick, watching us, playing us." Rick smirked. "She already won." Mark exploded. "Shut up!" Danny flinched at the sound, but Eleanor remained perfectly still. This was what she had been waiting for. Mark spun, eyes darting around. "Where the hell is Danny?" Rick's smirk faded. "You really don't see it, do you?" Mark stiffened. "She let him go," Rick said slowly, "and he ran straight back to us. You really think that was an accident?" Mark's grip on his gun tightened. "You think he's working for her?" Rick shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. But if I were you, I'd be wondering why she let him live." Mark hesitated. Just for a second. It was all the time Eleanor needed. From outside, she threw a rock against the metal siding of the warehouse. Clang. It was a small sound, but to Mark, already on the verge of breaking, it was an explosion. He spun toward the noise, gun raised. Rick moved at the same time, 2 guns cocked, 2 fingers on the trigger. Elena smiled. Then she flipped the power switch. Darkness. The entire warehouse went black. Mark fired first, a blind, panicked shot. The bullet hit metal, sparking. Rick cursed. "Shit!" Mark swung toward the voice and fired again. A loud thud followed. A groan. Then silence. Elena moved swiftly through the shadows. Her steps were calculated, smooth, noiseless. The dark was her ally. She reached the back of the warehouse, slipping inside just as Mark fumbled for a flashlight. A single beam cut through the darkness. Rick was slumped against a crate, blood spreading across his shirt. Not dead, but close. Danny was nowhere to be seen. Mark's breathing was frantic. "Where are you?" he muttered. His hands were shaking. He spun in circles, trying to spot movement. Eleanor took a slow step forward. He whipped around. She took another step. He couldn't see her, but he could feel her. "You lose," she whispered. Mark fired blindly, but the shot hit nothing. Then a sharp strike to his wrist. His gun clattered to the floor. He barely had time to react before Elena's fist met his throat. He gagged, stumbling backward. She didn't stop. A sharp elbow to the ribs, a kick to the back of the knee. Controlled. Precise. Mark collapsed, gasping for air. Elena crouched beside him, pressing the barrel of his own gun to his forehead. His eyes were wide now, not with anger but with fear. He finally understood. "Who sent you?" she asked quietly. Mark swallowed hard. "I don't know." Elena didn't move. He was trembling. "I swear, I don't. We were just supposed to take you, hold you, wait for orders, that's all." She studied him for a long moment, then lowered the gun. Mark let out a shaky breath until she struck him across the temple. He hit the floor, unconscious. Danny emerged from the shadows, pale, hands shaking. "Jesus!" Eleanor stood, unfazed. "Help me tie him up." Danny hesitated but obeyed. As they secured Mark, Rick groaned from the corner. Still alive, but barely. Elena turned to Danny. "How good are you at driving?" Danny blinked. I can drive, yeah." She glanced at Mark's unconscious form. "Then find the van." Danny hesitated. "Where are we taking him?" Elena wiped a trace of blood from her knuckles. "Somewhere quiet." Danny swallowed hard. Eleanor's voice was calm. "It's time to get some real answers." The warehouse was silent except for Mark's ragged breathing. He was slumped in the back of the van, wrists bound behind him, a fresh bruise forming on his temple. The faint glow of the dashboard lights cast shadows over his unconscious face. Danny sat in the driver's seat, his grip tight on the wheel, knuckles white. "Where are we taking him?" Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, her gaze locked on the road ahead. Somewhere quiet. Danny swallowed hard. He didn't ask again. The van rumbled down the dirt road away from the warehouse, away from the disaster they had left behind. Rick was dead. Mark was their prisoner. And somewhere out there, whoever had sent them was waiting for an update that would never come. Elena wasn't about to let them wait for long. An abandoned cabin. Hours later. The chair creaked as Mark stirred, his head lolling forward. His breathing hitched as awareness returned, along with pain. His eyes snapped open. He was tied to a chair. His gun was gone, and Elena Petrov stood in front of him, arms crossed, face unreadable. Danny hovered in the background, uncertain, shifting his weight. He wasn't built for this, but Elena didn't need him to be. Mark's gaze flickered between them. He chuckled darkly. I should have known you weren't normal. Elena tilted her head. You should have known a lot of things. He licked his split lip. You think this is over? Elena crouched in front of him, her voice calm. Too calm. Who sent you? Mark smirked. You're not gonna kill me. Without a word, Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out his own knife. She flipped it effortlessly, then jammed it into the wooden armrest, millimeters from his hand. Mark flinched. Elena didn't blink. The next one doesn't miss. Mark let out a slow breath. You're not getting anything from me. Elena studied him. Then, almost lazily, she said, Rick is dead. Mark's smirk faltered. She continued, voice smooth as silk. Danny's here because he realized you were never going to let him live. And you? She leaned in. You have no crew, no backup, and no more moves left to play. Mark clenched his jaw. Elena sighed. You were always disposable, weren't you? A hired hand. Someone else's pawn. Mark's silence was answer enough. Elena took a slow step back. You're not the real threat. The person who sent you is. Mark hesitated. If I talk, I'm dead. Elena smiled faintly. If you don't talk, you're already dead. Danny shifted uncomfortably. He didn't want to see where this was going. Elena? She held up a hand. Not now. Mark exhaled sharply. He knew he had lost. Fine, he muttered. You want to know the truth? Elena said nothing. Mark let out a bitter laugh. It's not just about you, it's about what you know. A cold, creeping sensation settled in Elena's stomach. Mark met her gaze. There's something from your past, something you buried. His lips curled slightly. And someone out there still wants it. Elena's pulse remained steady. She had spent decades burying things, lives, secrets, truths that should never resurface. But someone had found her anyway. Mark watched her closely, sensing the shift. Whoever they are, they know exactly who you are. And they're not done yet. Danny looked between them. What the hell does that mean? Elena remained silent. She knew exactly what it meant. It meant this wasn't just about her anymore. It meant someone powerful had been waiting for her to resurface. And now, the game had truly begun. The night stretched endless and silent around the abandoned cabin. The air was thick with tension. The kind of tension Elena knew well. The pause before the kill, the final breath before chaos erupted. Mark sat tied to the chair, his eyes calculating despite his predicament. Danny hovered near the door, shifting nervously. The van was parked just outside, ready to go, but Elena wasn't done yet. Mark had given her an answer. Someone from her past wanted something buried, but Elena needed more. Who? She asked again, voice steady. Mark chuckled, shaking his head. You think they'd tell me? I was just the middleman. Elena's expression remained unreadable. Then why send 3 amateurs? Mark's smirk faded. She took a slow step forward, her presence suffocating. If I'm such a threat, why not send professionals? Why not take me out quietly? Mark exhaled sharply. Because they didn't want you dead. Elena's fingers twitched. That answer was worse than she expected. They wanted you out in the open, Mark continued. They wanted you to make a move, a trap, a lure, and she had walked right into it. Her soft vibration hummed through the air. A phone. Elena reacted instantly, reaching into Mark's jacket pocket and pulling out his burner phone before he could protest. The screen lit up with a single message. We are watching. Elena's stomach turned ice cold. Then, gunfire. A bullet shattered the cabin window, lodging deep into the wooden wall. Danny screamed, ducking for cover. Mark flinched, real fear flashing in his eyes now. Elena moved, grabbing Danny and shoving him toward the back door. Run! Get to the van, now! Danny hesitated for only a second before bolting. Elena turned back to Mark. You have one chance to make it out of here alive. Mark's chest rose and fell rapidly. If they find me, I'm dead. Elena's grip on the gun tightened. Then make sure they don't. Another shot rang out, this time hitting the leg of the chair inches from Mark's foot. They weren't shooting to kill, not yet. They wanted her alive. Elena's mind worked fast. Unknown enemy, unknown numbers, but trained, organized. This wasn't some half-baked kidnapping anymore. She dragged Mark up from the chair and shoved him toward the door. Move. Mark stumbled, then obeyed, finally realizing that if he stayed, he was already a dead man. Outside, the van's engine roared to life. Danny was behind the wheel, eyes wild. Elena shoved Mark inside and leaped in after him just as another bullet whizzed past her shoulder. Danny hit the gas. The van lurched forward, tires kicking up dirt as it sped down the road. Through the back window, Elena caught a glimpse of figures emerging from the trees, black-clad, heavily armed. Not amateurs, ghosts from her past. Mark saw them too. His face went pale. Shit, you don't fight these people. Elena's eyes remained cold. I don't need to fight them. Danny was panicking. Where do we go? What do we do? Elena exhaled, forcing her mind to steady. There was only one option. They couldn't run. Not forever. They had to turn the hunt around. Head to the city, she ordered. We lose them in the streets. Danny swerved onto the main road, tires screeching. The enemy vehicles were already behind them, gaining fast. Elena turned to Mark, her voice like steel. Tell me everything you know, right now. Mark swallowed hard. You won't like the answer. Elena leaned in, the gun pressed to his ribs. I already don't. Mark hesitated. Then, with a defeated breath, he whispered, They're not after you. They're after what you buried. Elena's breath caught. She had buried a lot in her life, but only one secret was worth this kind of pursuit. And if they had found it, another gunshot rang out, hitting the side mirror. The van swerved. Danny yelled, We're gonna die! Elena's grip on the gun tightened. Not tonight. She turned toward the approaching vehicles, exhaling slow. One last fight, one last mission. And this time, she wouldn't run. She would finish this. The van skidded to a stop at the docks. The enemy SUVs roared in behind them, headlights cutting through the mist. Elena stepped out first. Calm, focused, ready. Mark groaned, still bound in the back, while Danny clutched the wheel, his hands trembling. We're trapped. Elena's eyes never left the approaching gunmen. No, they are. The first shot cracked through the air. Elena moved, rolling behind a crate as bullets struck metal. She counted their movements, their spacing. 14 men, tactical gear, suppressed weapons. They weren't here for a shootout. They wanted her alive. A mistake. Elena acted fast. A single shot to the nearest target, a knife to the next. She slipped through the shadows, eliminating them one by one. Mark struggled against his restraints, watching in horror. She's not human, he muttered. Danny ducked behind a crate, hyperventilating. Jesus, she's killing them. Elena reached the last shooter, twisting his rifle away and delivering a brutal strike to his throat. Silence fell. The docks were littered with bodies. Danny, still in shock, whispered, What now? Elena turned to Mark. Tell me who sent you. Mark coughed, smirking despite his pain. You still don't get it, do you? They weren't after you. They were testing you. Elena's grip tightened. Mark chuckled darkly. Looks like you passed. A phone buzzed in the pocket of a fallen man. Elena picked it up. A single message. We'll be in touch. She stared at the words. The real fight hadn't even begun. She wasn't done, and neither were they. The sun was rising by the time Elena and Danny left the docks behind. The city stretched before them, quiet, unaware of the blood that had been spilled in the night. Elena sat in the passenger seat of the stolen SUV, her fingers tapping against the burner phone. The message still glowed on the screen. You've passed the test. We'll be in touch. She had spent decades hiding, believing the past was buried, but it was never really gone. Danny cleared his throat, breaking the silence. So, what now? Elena turned to him, studying his face. He was different now. No longer the terrified kid caught in the middle of something bigger than him. You have two choices, she said. You disappear. Start over. Pretend none of this ever happened. Danny swallowed. And the other choice? Elena's voice was quiet. You stay, and you learn how to survive. Danny hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. I don't think I can go back to my old life. Elena gave a small, knowing smile. Neither could she. The SUV rumbled down the road, heading toward the unknown. She didn't know who was behind this. She didn't know how deep it went. But she knew one thing for certain. Whoever had started this game had made one fatal mistake. They thought she was just an old woman. They thought she was prey. But now she was hunting them. Her past had resurfaced. And this time, she wasn't running. A phone rings. Elena glanced at the burner phone. A new message appeared. Miss Petrov, we have another job for you. She exhaled. Then, with a slow smile, she answered, I'm listening.